it is in the interest of all of these companies to say, hey, how can we work with farms of different types and different sizes so that they can continue and we can continue? One, two, three.
Coming up on episode 406 of The Modern Acre, we're talking to the author of Land Rich, Cash Poor, Brian Resinger, talking about his family's story and the disappearing American farmer.
Tim, this is going to be such a good conversation. I love having authors on. They're the best. Well-spoken, good story, and this conversation was no exception with Brian. Before we get into this conversation, just want to remind you all, listeners of The Modern Acre, Tim and I have a membership community called the Modern Acre Co-op. And with the Modern Acre Co-op, Tim and I are doing bonus podcast episodes where we just talk about what we're into lately, what we're reading, what we're consuming, ideas we have, and the news that's happening each week. If you want some bonus Tim and Tyler content, check out the Modern Acre Co-op. We also do member calls where we bring everyone together in the co-op just to learn from each other what people are working on. This week on Friday, we're actually having our next members call. So if you want to participate, if you want to join, sign up with the Modern Acre Co-op. It's the price of a cold brew a month. We love cold brew, Tim and I. So if you want to check that out, it's the Modern Acre Co-op. We'll have the link in the show notes. And even better, as a co-op member, you get additional benefits like getting our new Farmer Mode hat at a discounted rate, or if you sign up for the annual plan for free. So, this is the perfect time to join, get the new Farmer Mode hat, get bonus podcast episodes, and join our member calls as part of the co-op. How was that sell, Tim?
Great sell, Ty. Great sell. Love having the co-op member calls. Love doing the co-op 10, our weekly one that we do. I have a running note in my phone. Anytime I come across a cool company, cool idea, put it in there so we can riff on these weekly calls.
All right. So check that in the show notes. We'd love the support. It's a way to support the podcast as well. All right, Tim, super excited for this conversation with Brian. Man, what an important topic. And we get into just his story and his journey. This is like the sneak peek of the book to hear from him directly about how he's viewing just the farm economy, the macro, as well as the micro, his family's experience with some of these market dynamics that exist in agriculture.
Yeah, Brian was actually able to come out and visit us on the farm last week, so it's fun to show him our operation. He comes from a Wisconsin farming background. They did a lot of dairy. They've done row crops, but coming to our farm where it's just different crops he hasn't seen before is cool, just kind of showing him and farmer to farmer of just something we're like super passionate about, showing off the farm. So I had a really good conversation with him out at the farm and was fun to have him on the podcast as well.
So we'll jump in with what's top of mind for Brian, but first a word from our sponsor, PF Partners. Hey guys, quick message from our sponsor, PF Partners. Growing your business in the agriculture space in 2025 is maybe harder than it's ever been. Investor funding has dried up, growers have tighter budgets than ever, and overall, it's just hard to go to market. PF Partners, a consulting firm with over a decade of experience scaling successful ad tech solutions globally, has just launched a new webinar on optimizing go-to-market strategies in the agribusiness space. It shows you what's changing in the market, exactly how to deal with it, everything is backed by research, and it's about go-to-market plays in the ag sector that you can use tomorrow. So if you're ready to turn your go-to-market efforts into results, go to themodernacre.com/PFP or text modern to 55444 to download the webinar for free. That's themodernacre.com/PFP or text modern to 55444.
The thing that's top of mind for me right now is thinking about the next 40 years. I'm 40 years old. The book that gets into the reasons our farms are disappearing goes back 100 years to the early 1900s. And when I think about what is going on right now, I think about the fact that, we have lost 45,000 farms per year on average for the past century. And it's like, what are the next 40 years going to look like? Mathematically, if we were to lose, 45,000 farms per year for, going forward, just like we did for the past century, we would lose the bulk of our family farms in the next 40 years. And I don't think that's a place that anybody wants to be. I think regardless of size of farm, type of farm, people want to continue to be able to grow something out of the ground and be able to feed our country. But if we were to lose most of our farms in the next 40 years, that would have a dramatic impact on the agriculture sector, rural areas all across the country. The way that we feed people in America all across the country, whether they've set foot in a farmyard or a field or not. And so I think a lot about, okay, what we've done for the past century, what are we going to do for the next 40 years? Is it going to continue the way that it has, or are we going to do something about it?
Such an important topic, Brian. And I think it's existential, right? Like, I think this is so important. And we know this, right? We see this in the farm census data. We see this in news articles. And I think that, a lot of people are trying to, how do we solve this problem? How do we tackle this problem? But I don't know if it's hit home for people. And that's why I think we need people like you that are like telling your story in a compelling way that actually can move the needle for policymakers, for the private markets, right? Like there's so much here. It's such a big problem. It's such a big challenge, but we need to know and understand the problem intimately, I think, right? To have action and to have change. So, I mean, Brian, let's learn a little bit more about your story. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and kind of your journey in ag?
Yeah, you bet. So I grew up on a farm in southern Wisconsin on the hills of the Driftless area. And I live in California now and split my time between there and southern Wisconsin. And it's given me a really interesting opportunity to sort of see the different worlds, the different way that agriculture is interacting with our country. When my wife and I moved here, we first went to the Bay Area, and then we ended up in the Sacramento area. And what we loved about the Sacramento area was that it's the farm to fork capital, and all the surrounding agriculture land, the local food movement that has people bringing so much homegrown food into restaurants all across the area. That's something that I hadn't necessarily seen before. In Wisconsin, where I'm from, it's dairy country, it's row crops, and there are certainly people who are growing fresh local food, but so much of it is commodity products and commodity crops that are shipped around the country and around the globe. And there's a lot of that in California too. So going back and forth between those two worlds has really opened my eyes to the way that American agriculture informs the way that we feed our entire country. For us in our story, it began nearly more than 100 years ago when my great grandfather came over to Wisconsin from Bavaria, Germany, and they wanted to find a better life in America. So they dug their living out of the dirt. This was early 1900s subsistence farming. My grandpa went on to grow up in the Depression and climb out of the Depression in the middle class. My parents got the farm through the farm crisis in the 1980s. My sister and I grew up in globalization and the recessions of the 2000s. And what we really do with Land Rich Cash Poor is we go into those hidden eras of history that have driven the disappearance of our farms, and we weave that with our family story. And I've had the opportunity to share that all across the country, and it has been really a unique experience to be able to say, hey, here was something that was going on in our life, and here's the way that was being impacted by economic, political, or technological factors. And what I've found is when you get people's attention on this issue, it clicks. It can be hard, even with people who buy from local farmers markets, it can be hard to necessarily make sure they understand where the food is coming from, just because it's not something that we talk about quite as much. And so the way that we've been able to navigate that and the way we've shared our story, I have found that once people realize it, a light bulb goes off, and you can really start to have conversations about how we can, figure a way forward on sustainability and the economics of farming and all of the issues that we wrestle with every day.
Yeah, there seems to just be a crazy disconnect between kind of where food actually comes from, food production, to the consumer and what the consumer wants, of just really not being able to cross that chasm. So it's cool to hear you kind of tell those stories. Ty and I have been doing an ongoing book challenge and starting to read more than I usually read at night, typically fiction. Pick up your book, and I love the subject matter, but it was a little bit too much for me to fall asleep to, because it just got me so passionate, so fired up, because it's such a heavy topic and it's so personal, because like we've lived that journey as well, kind of like navigating different cycles of up and down. It's not up and to the right and easy peasy in farming like the hear our dads talk about the 1980 farm crash and everything that happened there. And like we were impacted in the early 2000s with NAFTA and production going away. So it's cool to see people kind of take a stand and start talking about kind of the realities of farming and the current reality. So yeah, maybe talk to us about kind of the current situation that you see on the ground. Like obviously new administration coming in, a lot of changing in policy, and like what's being done to address this aging out farmer population, farms going out of business. Like talk to us about kind of what your latest thoughts are there.
Yeah, it's an extremely dynamic situation. And, as you guys know from having lived this and watched it, farms have, for decades, farmers have been subject to really cross-cutting political winds. And all throughout the history that we tell in the book, you're able to, whether it's the farm crisis or other places, you're able to see where both parties have caused all kinds of problems. Both parties had policies that were supposed to help that didn't, or policies that were supposed to accomplish some sort of policy goal and they didn't achieve what they were supposed to. And so that's something that has happened all over the map. What we're finding right now is that the Trump administration is coming in and they are pursuing tariff policies and different things around trade that have a real impact. And I always tell people that it is a very complicated situation for farmers. On the one hand, farmers have been victim to unfair trade deals in one way or another for a very long time, whether it's China or other foreign adversaries, other foreign trading partners that haven't been necessarily operating above board. There have been unfair trade practices. There have been ways that China's been able to depress the price, all kinds of things that have happened. And at the same time, while farmers are able to look around and say, hey, this is something that has been affecting us for a long time, it's also true that our farms can be subject to foreign retaliation when we have, say a tariff put on another country. And we are seeing how that is playing out. And the reality is that you hear the agriculture groups talk about how, we need to have fair and free trade, and you need to be able to have both of those things. And so I think that right now we are seeing a wide range of things happen that all tie back to the kind of those cross-cutting winds. And when you think about how that applies to families like ours, I think about my dad. He's in his 70s now. My sister's working to take over from him. And the reality of the situation is he has to look at this and say, okay, how much longer can I keep going? As my daughter plans to take over, what sort of headwinds is she going to face? And, the reality of the situation is that different crops and products being affected by these world markets really does factor into that. So there's a lot of talk about what we can do. And I think that the only thing that farmers can do is be clear-eyed about the opportunities and the threats that are out there and really do our best to talk as members of a farm family. How can we continue forward? What are we going to do around these crops and products that are impacted? What are the new products that we can try to pursue? And that's sort of an ongoing conversation from one generation to the next at all times.
I think it's something that we've preached on this podcast a lot, is the need to constantly be innovating, right? As a farmer, you can't be sitting back and hoping someone or something is going to save you. You have to be constantly thinking about innovation, growth, sustainability of your operation, right? I think it's critical. Brian, the name of your book, so catchy, so good, right? It's Land Rich, Cash Poor. Can you explain, like, what does that mean and why is that important?
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
Concept?
I appreciate your question about that. It's something that is just ingrained in the way that I grew up. And I know that's the case for you guys too. As I was growing up, I knew that my dad was doing something special. I knew that farms like ours were rare because we'd have guys coming in the driveway saying, oh, this farm went under, this farm sold. So I always knew that our farms were disappearing from the time I was working with my dad in the farmyard. And I, growing up, could see that what we had was really valuable also, and my the amount of land, the equipment, and it was just very obvious that there was something going on here. So what I wanted to do as I got older is I pursued a career off the farm. I wanted to try to answer that question. Why are those farms disappearing? What I found is that we had an economic system that was really leaving our farms behind. And the concept of land rich, cash poor just coming back to me as I was looking at this. And land rich, that part is about the land that farmers own, right? There's a beautiful, large expanse of farmland in California, all across the Midwest. That land is worth so much money if you were to decide to sell it. But the cash poor part is where you're holding on to the land because you're trying your best to make a living. And so many farms are just grinding out a living where each year they're making a little bit less. The input costs are going up. The money that they're making, off of selling commodity crops or selling into local farmers markets, whatever the case may be, are not keeping pace, sometimes going up, sometimes going down. And so there's this squeeze. And so if families want to make it and hold on to their land, they're going to be cash poor because they're not going to be making the money that they need to continue forward. But if they want to turn around and sell it, then they lose everything else. Because when you grow up on farms, you guys know a farm is your home, it's your community, it's your heritage, it's everything. And so farm families are left with that kind of terrible dilemma of trying to decide, are we going to hold on and face a day where we have to tell the kids we can't make it, or we're going to turn around and sell it and lose everything else?
Yeah, it's interesting times right now. Like we farm in an area where there's a lot of wine grapes, and that commodity especially is really hurt. And just having conversations with wine grape growers and fifth generation guys, farmed his entire career, doesn't have kids in place, and like he's basically has this burden of he's going to be the one that loses the farm. And it's like, yeah, to your point, like existential of like making that decision of like, is it time to hang it up? And it's like your whole identity is being a farmer. To give that up is just like a huge mental burden. Just like if you had some other occupation that you had distinct from your life, but farming's so integrated. Brian, you talked about like your dad, like he was able to weather the storm, was always doing innovative things. You saw that he has something special. Like what was he doing differently?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I grew up, there's a picture of me when I'm a little kid with my parents, and it's one of these dairy publications where they came out to the farm and talked to my parents about what they did to overcome a challenge. And at that time, we were about a 50 cow dairy farm, and we had throughout the herd a infection called mastitis. And for those who don't know what mastitis is it's a sickness that hits the cows, and it spoils the milk, and it also sickens the cows. And so this was a huge problem. It was spreading through about half the herd, and they didn't know what they were going to do. They were going to have to dump milk. They had all kinds of problems with this. Well, one of the things my dad did was in keeping with something they've been doing for a long time, which is he tried to innovate. So he took a look at this problem, and he knew that if he and my mom invested in something called a pipeline system, it would improve sanitation. So this was a system that took the milk from the cow's udders out to the cooling tank in the milk house, out to the bulk tank, and it improved sanitation. It also meant that they had, way less labor and steps to be able to transport the milk from the cows to the bulk tank. And it was something that really revolutionized everything. That was something that's called a scale neutral technology. And what I mean by that is it's a technology that could work for large as well as medium and small farms. And, putting in a pipeline that goes from every cow to the milk house outside the barn is not a small thing, but it's a practical thing for farms of all sizes. And it is something that farms that don't have a whole lot of money could still afford. They could still finance it. And so that was an example of a scale neutral technology. My dad over and over was looking for different ways that they could evolve their farm operation to be able to make it. And one thing that happened in the decades since is that we began to lose focus on scale neutral technology. Technology is still moving American agriculture forward. Innovation and increased productivity is still a huge part of what's going on our farms throughout the Midwest, throughout the Great Plains, out here in the western part of the country. But losing focus on scale neutral technology has had an impact. So I'll give you an example. The pipeline that we installed in our barn, as my dad got into the 90s and 2000s, the only real way for him to be able to continue milking cows would be to tear down that barn and to build a much larger milking parlor. And we talked about that. We thought about it. It's not to say that it's a bad thing. There are different farmers that made different decisions to try to get bigger by building a parlor or taking other steps like that. It just wasn't for my dad. And so what we found is over time, rather than having those new systems like a pipeline system that you could put in, you had to really shift to an entirely new facility. And that is something that began to have an impact, to take a toll. It's not a world that we have to live in. Technology is helping our farms advance sustainability wise, keep up with the changes going on in our economy, but it is something that was a challenge. And so as we get into this world where we have fewer and fewer farms, seeing technology advancing American agriculture, but leaving so many of our farms behind is one of those challenges. And it speaks to what my dad was really doing that, has worked for a long time. But we need to make changes in order for it to continue to work.
Let's dig in on this topic, because I think this is a common discussion in ag tech, is this idea of where does the investment flow? And inherently, especially in VC-backed ag tech startups, the money is flowing to bigger farms because there's economies of scale, they have the market penetration and size and dollars and acres to invest in that ag tech. Is that a problem? And if so, like how do we change that paradigm?
Yeah, it is a problem. And it's one that I'm engaging with folks on and having a conversation about. And when I talk with people who are involved in the agriculture industry from like the agribusiness standpoint, we're engaging with farms, also people in tech who are taking a look at, how can different types of technology help us with what we're doing with our farmland, our fields, GPS technologies, all kinds of different things. One of the things that I say to people, whether they are a supplier to a farm or whether they're a buyer of farm products, is that it's in everyone's interest to be thinking about scale neutral technology because of what we were talking about at the top of the program, right? So if we continue to lose farms at the rate of 45,000 a year for the next 40 years, that's enough loss for us to lose most of the rest of our family farms. People are often surprised to hear that we have nearly 2 million farms left and 96% of them are family operations, right? If we continue to lose farms at that same rate, we're going to lose most of our farms. And so what I say to people, whether they're in ag tech, whether they're in equipment manufacturing, whether they are seed companies, fertilizer companies, it's like, how many farms do we need for you to have a customer base, right? And so private research and development, which is a huge share of the research and development that occurs in this country, it is in the interest of all of these companies to say, hey, how can we work with farms of different types and different sizes so that they can continue and we can continue? There's also the question of government R&D, and government R&D is at its lowest level since the 1970s, and it has also abandoned in many ways scale neutral technology. So there's a need for a discussion about the government policy part of that. But when I'm talking with all of the folks in the private sector, it's like, hey, you want to have that diverse array of farmers of all sizes you can work with. How can we focus on technology that can help us do that before it's too late?
Yeah, it's like kind of alarming, the statistics about farms going out of business. It seems like not a lot of people are talking about this. Like you look at kind of latest USDA bites and it's more about like the cost of eggs and like stuff like this. And it's like our family farmers are going out of business and no one's really focused there. Like who in your network, like who's working on this to steady the ship and reverse the trend?
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And it is a challenge. I mean, especially when you talk about ag tech, I mean, you're right. I mean, the investment flows where the money is going to be. And there's a gap between those boardroom conversations and what's going on the farm. I do think there's a lot of really good conversations going on. I think there are a lot of good conversations at some of our land grant universities. I think there's good conversations going on within some of our food companies. But those conversations are too few and too far between to have had a big enough impact yet. And so that's why I'm hoping that we can continue to shine a light on that.
Brian, I've always been fascinated by this dynamic, this whole land rich, cash poor dynamic. It seems like this almost seems like an economics problem or a finance problem of there is, part of the book title is rich, right? There is this, farmers have seen the benefit of increasing farmland prices or increasing farm values over the past several decades, right? It's actually become very hot to invest in farmland, right? And so that is there's a lot of truth to that, and I think a lot of farmers' wealth is tied up in this. But then you have this cash poor dynamic, right? So that's impacting decision making, and that's impacting if and when they sell the farm because they're not able to make their payments. Like, is there a solution? Is there a finance solution here? I know there's been a few companies looking at this dynamic, right? Because how can we tap into that rich piece to help fund the operations and help grow the business ultimately?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of policymakers that I've talked to on both sides out who are looking at this issue of, okay, you have land that's there in the hands of one generation. Generally, where I'm from, the next generation will be buying the farm from the prior generation, right? And so there needs to be the ability to make those farm payments over a long enough period of time where the older generation is able to be supported in retirement. The younger generation can find that to be affordable. And oftentimes what we have is it is very difficult to work out that situation. Sometimes it's because families have different ideas about what they want to do. Sometimes it's just because of the amount of money involved. But then you get into situations also where there are farm families that don't have successors. Like, myself, I mean, my sisters were going to take over. I've come back and forth. I'm involved in the farm today. I help on the business side. They throw me in a tractor my day off, which is kind of a truth for farm kids. And, but we've really looked at this as, how is my sister going to carry things forward while I'm working to tell our story and out there looking for a solution? We were on a different page. I can only imagine how difficult it would become, right? Then you get into families that don't have land in their family, and you get, 4-H kids, FFA kids who want to get the chance to buy into some land, and the land is owned by a farmer down the road who, doesn't have a son or a daughter. What do you do there? There have been discussions around how can we have the tax code be more favorable? The tax code be such that the older generation is given a lower tax burden and a better economic incentive to sell the farm to the next generation, especially in situations where those FFA or 4-H kids are trying to buy a farm that isn't in their family. Can you have people coming out of an apprenticeship program where they're able to take advantage of a lower tax burden for that older farmer? So there's all these ways that people are trying to work on it. But at the end of the day, it still comes back to the fact that we've had economic, political, and technological reasons for our farms to be disappearing. And over, decade after decade, you see people dealing with those reasons. And what they're left with is that their land is so incredibly valuable. And meantime, they've got all these challenges that they've been facing. And so whether it's people who are pursuing farmland for development, whether it's people who are pursuing farmland to be able to build a house, whether it's people who are pursuing farmland for some other purpose, they are so often able to offer the kind of dollars that a farmer can't get by transferring the farm to the next generation, whether it's their child or someone else.
Brian, you give great historical context in your book, kind of talking through the generations of your family. And we already talked about the controversial subject of tariffs. And maybe let's talk subsidies for a little bit, where I think crop subsidies came about like post-World War II as a way to kind of like bolster domestic food production. And they've stayed in place when we've kind of solved that issue. But so maybe just talk to us about your latest thoughts around subsidies.
Yeah, absolutely. When I look at the situation with our government, as you say, it happened, as we're coming out of World War II. I mean, prior to that, the Great Depression was such an earth-shaking time that it led to a lot of government intervention. And we came into the post-World War II era and into the 1950s. And we had a situation where the American agriculture industry was really surrounded by increasingly large government. And since that time, we've really sort of piled one program on top of another. And I always tell people, you can be for or against a particular government program helping agriculture. You can be for or against a particular subsidy. But when you pile one on top of another, you aren't really able to take stock of what's working, right? Because you got some programs that maybe aren't working the way they should have from the beginning. We can't tell anymore because there's another program laid over top of that. Sometimes the programs are contradictory. And also, I think something that people on the left or the right can agree on is that over time, government programs can become prone to abuse and favoritism. And so we have those three factors, things becoming ineffective, things being contradictory, and things being prone to abuse and favoritism, all factored into this. And so when we talk about subsidies, there are all kinds of programs where people could say, hey, look, we need to have a basic baseline safety net for those uncontrollable factors around weather and things like that can impact our farmers, right? But also the ability for those subsidies to pick winners and losers because it's gone on for so long is very, very real. And so you have this situation where you've got taxpayers, you could argue you have taxpayers rightly saying, where's my money going? And you got family farmers rightly saying, hey, where's all that support that was supposed to be coming? And so I've said that I think we need to have a bipartisan family farm moonshot where we marshal all of our resources around research and development, around subsidies, around all regulation, around all these different things. And we look and see what's working and what isn't. And if it isn't working, how do we reform it? But until we do that, we really have a wide range of crops and products that are subsidized differently than others. And it impacts what farmers decide to grow. It impacts what we eat as consumers. And we don't necessarily all know what's going into that calculus.
Yeah, I think this needs to be looked at with almost like a zero-based budgeting exercise, right? Of like what, to your point, what's working, what's not. Everything should be kind of rethought, right? Because we need to have I think, a robust look at this comprehensively, not just piecemeal, because as to your point, all these things tie together.
Yeah.
Brian, as we kind of wrap up here, you have a lot of, I think a lot of unique perspective into agriculture. Would love to learn, other than what you've mentioned, what's your ag hot take?
That's such a great question. My big thing that I always talk to people about is just the reasons for optimism. And as I was writing the book, talking to my family, piecing together these stories, we had stories of farm field accidents. We had stories of weather that blesses and threatens. We had stories of economic upheaval, all these challenges. We also had these incredible stories of resilience. And I think about my dad when he was a kid. My grandpa had, again, grown up in the Great Depression, climbed into the middle class. And it was in the 1950s that my dad was 8 years old when my grandpa slipped off a corn crib, fell 30 feet, and hit the frozen ground and broke his back. And my dad, at the tender age of 8, stepped up and started working full time on the farm. And my grandma ran the farm during that time. We had neighbors who came and milked in the morning and the evening to help, but all the work being done before, between, and after the milkings was something that my dad and grandma were doing together. And, fast forward now more than 60 years, he's been at it for more than 60 years. He's 73 years old and he's still farming. And I can guarantee you right now, he's on the back of the tractor. It is early spring planting season. And whenever he isn't, that's where he wants to be. And it gets down into your blood and gets down into your bones. And so I think about, a little 8-year-old kid like that who had to step up when his father had broken his back. And I look at my dad still doing it today. And it just gives me so much hope to think about what we can do. We've got farm families who are continuing to move forward, trying to make sure that they can provide what our country needs to eat, even though we haven't made the economics work for so long. Imagine what could happen if we made it work. And so there's nearly 2 million farm families left, and 96% of them are family farms. I know that my story is not unique. You guys have stories like this in your family. Maybe the difference with our family is that we just had the chance to, pick our heads up and tell our story. And there are so many farm families that have experienced similar things over the years. And my hope is just that we can recognize that and that we can do something to try and harness that.
I think that perspective is so important. I think in a challenging farm economy, things can be kind of doom and gloom, but to kind of focus on the positives and perseverance and resilience, to your point, I think helps keep everybody positive moving forward. I was out of the farm this morning with my dad and my daughter, and so we had 3 generations on the farm playing around on tractors. So it doesn't get any better than that. Well, Brian, this has been a ton of fun. Thanks for coming on the podcast. As we wrap up, how can listeners get in touch and connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So people can find Land Rich Cash Poor on Amazon or anywhere else that buy books online. It's also available in bookstores nationwide. As for me, I'm at my website, which is www.brian-reisinger.com. That's Brian, BRIAN-Reisinger, REISINGER.com. I'm also on X at Brian J. Reisinger. And I just appreciate anybody who picks up the book, who spreads the word on these issues, who engages with this podcast episode, anybody who wants to keep the conversation going. I'm just deeply grateful.
All right, guys, if you enjoyed that interview, be sure to check out Brian's book, Land Rich, Cash Poor. We'll link it in the show notes if you want to dig more into his story and this topic. And join us in the members call on a Friday. If you're interested, sign up for the co-op today. We'll send you all the details. We appreciate you guys listening and the support, and we'll be back next week.